Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Professor Charan Ranganath and Professor Gloria Mark. Thanks for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 300 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. We are honored and thrilled to be welcoming back Professor Gloria Mark to FAN. We hosted her this past winter for her excellent book, Attention Span. She is Chancellor's Professor Emerita at the Donald Bren School of Information Computer Sciences at the University of California, Irvine, and has been a visiting senior researcher at Microsoft Research since 2012. For over 2 decades, she has studied the impact of digital media on people's lives, focusing on how using our devices affects our multitasking, distractions, mood, and behavior. Professor Mark's work has appeared on Sanjay Gupta's Chasing Life on CNN, CBS Sunday Morning, The Ezra Klein Show, Dax Shepard's Armchair Expert, and many others. She was also featured on Hidden Brain. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and The Atlantic, to name just a few. Joining her, our featured guest tonight, Charan Ranganath, is a professor at the University of California, Davis, at their Center for Neuroscience and Department of Psychology, and he is the director of the Dynamic Memory Lab. He studies the neural and functional organization of human memory processes in healthy individuals and in people with memory disorders. He has investigated the brain mechanisms that support memory for past events, known as episodic memory, and the maintenance of remembered information to guide future behavior, known as working memory. Professor Ranganath completed his master's and Ph.D. in clinical psychology at Northwestern University, just a stone's throw from the FAN office. So now let's welcome Charan Ranganath and Gloria Mark.
Thank you so much, Lonnie. So, Charan, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you tonight. So when I read your book, Why We Remember, I really enjoyed it because I was originally trained as a psychologist. Even though I study computers and smartphone use and devices and, everything in our digital age, my roots go back to psychology. And so reading your book was like being with old friends again. So I really enjoyed going through some of these studies and revisiting them. So it was really great. But I want to start with a basic question. Why did you decide to study memory?
Well, it's a good question, and one in which I have to remember in order to find out the right answer. So I was in clinical psychology in grad school, and like you, I had a past life in psychology. My past life was in clinical, and I spent a lot of my clinical time studying people with, or doing testing, I should say, with in the neuropsychology clinic. So people who come in with suspected brain damage, and we're supposed to do cognitive assessments on them. And I saw people with a whole lot of different things going on with them, ranging from early Alzheimer's to clinical depression to head injuries, even untreated syphilis. But the overwhelming majority of people who came into the clinic were coming either because they were worried they had memory problems or someone else close to them felt that they had memory problems. So it just became apparent to me how important memory is in people's lives. And then I also was doing work in the clinic doing psychotherapy, and psychotherapy involving cognitive behavior therapy, which is what I was doing, was all about basically learning and memory and trying to pull out people's memories and get them to look at their memories from a different perspective and maybe challenge some of the assumptions that people have about the memories that they told about, or the stories they would tell about their lives. So everything came back to memory. And at that time, we really had an unprecedented way to be able to understand how memory works in the brain. And I just felt like I had to jump in while I could to learn how to scan people's brains and find out how memory works.
Okay. So now I'm going to throw a really basic question at you, which is how do we form memories? And then there was a part in the book that really struck me because you mentioned that neurons in our brains work like a democracy. instead of like individual neurons. And, at this point in time, I think everyone is thinking about democracy at a much broader level and thinking about how fragile democracy is. But can you explain what you mean by how neurons work in a democratic way to form
Yeah.
memory?
Yeah, I mean, this is that was part of the fun in writing this was I kept thinking about the upcoming election, and it's really hard, I think, to explain how networks of neurons give rise to memories, and so that was why I thought the election analogy was good. But basically, the idea is that no single neuron stores a memory. And in fact, you have a limited population of neurons, but you've got many, many, many memories that are stored in your brain. So the idea is that a memory isn't represented by one neuron, but rather by a coalition of neurons that are kind of working together. And so you can think of them kind of like a political party, right? And the reason why I think the election is a nice analogy is parties compete with each other in elections. And in the same way, memories compete with each other when you're trying to pull up the right memory. So the idea is that when you have an experience, well, there could be all sorts of memories that can come up in relation to that. But eventually one party or one group of neurons will win that election. And then what happens is that there's a shakeup in the party. And so you can imagine, like in a real election, donors start pouring money into the winners of the election, right? And so the people who are loyal to the candidate will end up becoming tighter, and you pull them in, and the people who are less loyal, you might throw them out of the party. And that's kind of what happens with memories, where once we have some learning that takes place, there's a reorganization in the connections between neurons in the brain. And that's what allows us to learn and to recall information later on, is that when we have these strengthened connections, these coalitions of neurons that are working for this common cause, if you mobilize some of those neurons, then the rest of them will come online too, and you'll be able to pull up the other members of the party and then recall the thing that you're trying to recall.
Okay. And just to push this a little bit farther, it's I'm struck by how short people's memories are of things that happen in the world. But let's move on to another question. Another part that I found really interesting was that you write that you see memories more like a painting than a photograph. So photograph captures exactly what's there, what's realistic. But, paintings are up to the interpretation of the painter. And I actually started out as an artist, so that's why I was so attracted to this metaphor. But if we push this even a little bit further, can memories sometimes be like a realistic painting, but other times they might be like an impressionist painting?
Yes, I mean, it's a great way of putting it, and I think that's true. And that's why I wanted to, that's why I like the painting analogy, because essentially a lot of memory research focuses on remembering details of experiences that people actually can do pretty well with remembering. And then there's a whole nother line of work, as your friend Beth Loftus is a big part of this, that focuses on how memories can stray away from reality. And I think the best way to think about it is not to get caught up in our memories true or our memories false. They're just experiences that we have in our heads, right? And parts of those experiences, these little subjective thoughts and feelings that we have that give us the sense of the past, reflect truths from our past experience, just like a painting can have some photorealistic details in it. But other parts reflect our stories that we're constructing in our heads to try to make sense of it. And likewise, you might have parts of a painting that are not faithful to the subject, but capturing some deeper impression that you might have. And then some parts of it are neither true nor false. It's just the way that you see the world.
So when you talk about stories, it reminds me of one of my favorite researchers, Carl Weick. Carl Weick is an organizational behaviorist at University of Michigan. And he said something that always I always go back to, he said, we don't know what we think until we hear what we say. Now, he was referring to critical reasoning. The process of articulating helps make ideas clear to us and helps our reasoning become much more clear. But we also tell stories, right? We're a storytelling species. And I was thinking when you were talking about stories, could the way that we relay stories, the way we articulate them, can that affect our memories of them? Because, of course, we're constructing narratives. We want narratives to be consistent. We want them to be a certain way. But the way that we're describing them, can that actually change our memories of these stories?
Absolutely. One of the interesting aspects of memory is that the act of remembering can change the memory itself. And so, just in general, what we find is that when people remember something, that memory can be strengthened. Sometimes related memories can be weakened, or sometimes related memories can be strengthened. And sometimes people can introduce inaccuracies into their memory over the course of trying to remember something in the past. So it's almost like as if you go back in a time machine when you remember, and anything that you do in that past time can change the record of what happened, really. And so storytelling is an interesting part of the human condition. There's a huge percentage of the time. I can't remember what the statistic was. It was something like 30 to 40% of human conversations are spent storytelling. And when we're telling stories, we're sharing memories, really. And part of the act of storytelling is aiming the story for a particular audience and being able to try to convey some message that I want you to get. And in the process of doing that, we shape our memories and we shape the narrative that we put together in our memories, which is why experiences like psychotherapy can be so powerful, because just the process of talking about a memory for something that was traumatic that you've never shared with anyone can change your relationship with it and give you this chance to update the memory in a way that could be more adaptive.
Mm. So, Charan, throughout the book, you talk about your experience as a musician and you bring up, fun stories about when you played music. And I enjoyed it because I was also thinking of having been an artist and how I connect that to things I study with computers and smartphones. Um, but you talked about imagination, right? Imagination that, it's part of being a musician, part of being an artist. And you talked about how imagination draws on our past experience. Um, can you say more about this link between imagination and memory? And I want to bring up one thing is that there's a lot of discussion now as we're using large language models that even though large language models like ChatGPT might be writing stories or writing poems, are they really original because they're drawing on what already exists on the web? So, what is the link between imagination and memory?
Oh, it's such a rich topic, and I would love to ask you a bunch of questions about LLMs and human computer interaction, because it's a really fascinating time right now. But I think it's an apt analogy, because we often think of imagination as something that just comes up out of the blue. But in fact, the only way we can imagine anything is by synthesizing it out of past experiences, things that we understand. And what you find is that if you scan people's brains while they're recalling a past event, the brain activity looks very, very much like what happens when people imagine an event that never happened, sometimes even imagining something that couldn't have happened. So there seems to be this bidirectional relationship between memory and imagination. One of the things that you find is that on the one hand, when people remember, they use imagination to fill in the blanks and to be the connective tissue that allows people to make a story. So when people remember the past, they don't really replay it. They imagine how it could have been.
Mm.
But likewise, if you look at people with memory problems, what you find is they often will have a very impoverished imagination. That is, they don't seem to be able to pull up a lot of details about things that could happen because they don't have as rich of a repertoire of memories to go from. And so, coming back to this question of what does it mean to imagine and what's the nature of human imagination, I think we know that a lot of imagined products reflects our semantic memory, our knowledge about the world. And sometimes that can be extraordinarily unoriginal, right? I mean, how many times do you read a book or you see a movie and you feel like you can predict it from like the first page or the first 5 minutes? So there's a lot of work that just reflects anything an LLM can do, which is just read in a bunch of information from the culture. But I think what makes creative work special is that you and I and everyone listening has these unique lived experiences, right? I mean, think about your roommate in college or something. Often these are people who just happen to be randomly put in with, and they influence you in sometimes profound ways. And that gives you these rich repertoire of random memories that allows me to imagine something that you could not imagine because you don't have those episodic memories. And I think this is like a key limitation to LLMs and other generative AI sources is they don't have episodic memories. And it's that randomness that allows us to put together things that seem really new because I've got such a unique repertoire of memories to draw from.
That's what makes humans unique. Okay, let's get into the hard science, and let's start with the hippocampus. So throughout the book, you refer a lot to the hippocampus, and this is really central to determining if people remember or forget something. So can you tell us what's the hippocampus? Why is it so important?
Well, you can ask 10 neuroscientists and get 10 different answers, but in many ways they'll tell you the same thing, which is that part of what makes the hippocampus special is that it's not special in the sense that it's getting a lot of information from all over the brain and it's putting it together based on the fact that it was all experienced at a particular place in time, right? So let's say if I were to go down to Irvine, and actually I will be going to Irvine soon, but let's say if I was going down to Irvine and I was there and I was walking along the beach, I might see some kid playing with a ball. I might have a part of my brain that's active saying, hey, that's a ball. I might have a part of my brain that's processing the information about the kid's face and about the scenery and about my emotions. And the hippocampus is in this unique spot to just grab all of those things and synthesize them into one lump. So that later on, if I see that kid or I'm on that beach later, that information can allow the hippocampus to pull up and activate all the other cell assemblies associated with the different parts of the event. So it allows us to put a context on our past experiences and use that as a glue to bind together different memories of events that we've experienced.
Okay. So another key part of the brain that you talk about with respect to memory is the prefrontal cortex. And you also mentioned something that really caught my eye. You said that some things we do in our modern lives can wear down the prefrontal cortex. And you talked about multitasking. And this made me immediately think about some of the findings that I've had in looking at how people use computers and smartphones. And we find that people are switching their attention all the time on their devices. And in fact, we find it to be about 47 seconds on average that they switch. What effect does this kind of behavior have on the ability of the prefrontal cortex to do its job?
Well, I think it's good to give people a sense of what the prefrontal cortex is supposed to do, which is it's not really specialized for any one thing as much as it's specialized, as much as it's designed to sort of help other brain areas coordinate towards a common goal. So they talk about it, as you know, being important for executive functions. And the idea is an executive isn't really capable of doing anything in the company. But the job of the executive is to really lead and to really put everything together towards a common cause. And so a lot of times, if you look at people with damage to the prefrontal cortex, what happens is they know how to walk, they know how to talk, they can do everything, but they don't do what they need to do when they need to do it in order to get the job done. That is, they have the knowledge, but they can't apply it and use it in a way that can help them reach their goals. So when we are multitasking, the problem is that the prefrontal cortex is trying to marshal all the resources in the brain towards a goal. And when you multitask, you're actually not doing two tasks at the same time. There's an exception we can talk about, which is chunking tasks. But basically, I'm really switching between two goals. So that switch means that there's a little reconfiguration in what's going on in the prefrontal cortex. And that uses up attentional resources, as you know, and you've shown so beautifully. And those attentional resources mean that we slow down. There's actually a multitude of different costs that happen at various levels, but it just basically means we're slower. We're trying to catch up and get up to speed again. So if I'm talking to you and then occasionally I take a peek at my email, what happens is that now my prefrontal cortex is using up resources to get caught up again. But then when I come back to our conversation, I have to shift gears yet again. And so I'm always behind. Also, there's some work, I might have actually heard this from you, that just the literal act of shifting can stress you out.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself can shut down the prefrontal cortex and make you more automatic and make you more reactive and more distractible, really. So
Yes.
it really is it's just, and then on top of it, what happens is when we're shifting back and forth, we're behind. So we're not really understanding and meaningfully processing what's going on. And so we get these memories that are very blurry and very, very fragmented from it. And so I don't know about you, but I end up at conferences all the time where people are checking their emails during academic talks. And then they walk out and they say, oh, yeah, nothing interesting happened. But that's only because they couldn't remember any of the talks in the first place.
Yes, I definitely see that a lot. And in fact, this last week, I was at a large academic conference, and it happened fortuitously to be in Hawaii. So I was very happy about that. And I saw people at this conference. It's the flagship conference of my field. And I saw people who I haven't seen in a few years since before COVID. But what was really interesting is that when I saw them again, all of a sudden I could remember details of things that they had told me many, many years ago. But for example, I saw a friend and a colleague, and all of a sudden I remembered where he had gone to graduate school, who his advisor was, stories he had told me about grad school. But if you had asked me to recall these things before I went to the conference, I really doubt that I would have been able to do it. So what is it about context that enables us to be able to recall these details?
Well, the hippocampus is really designed to put together memories based on context. So it's basically saying, hey, there's this conglomeration of stuff that defines this place in this time. And so it's grabbing and associating pieces of information based on that context. And so what happens is if the context is unique, if it's something that is basically something that you don't experience very often, then a clue to that context, like being at a conference, for instance, there's a lot of aspects of context that are very unique to conferences, right? And so that opens up this window to all of these memories that are associated with that context. The context is a little cue, almost like a key to unlock these memories, right? And that's why there's certain things like music or smells or tastes. If they're unique to a particular place and time in our lives, they can act as cues that allow us to access memories from those times. And it's one of those things where even though we forget a lot of our experiences, we have many more memories than we can really imagine because we just don't have the cues in front of us. And so seeing these people we haven't seen in forever, or smelling something or hearing a song on the radio, can bring us back in a very powerful way and open up these memories that we forgot we even had.
Mm. So, okay, let's talk about schemas. So if you go to another city in the US and you walk into a Starbucks, you have a pretty good idea of the protocol you need to order a frappuccino. I was once on a subway in Tokyo, and I do not read Japanese, but I had the Japanese characters of the place, of the stop where I wanted to get off. But I understood the protocol that these stops would be displayed in the order in which, the subway would be traveling. So I was doing pattern matching, looking at my characters, trying to see if it matched the pattern of the stop where I needed to get off. So I was applying a schema to help navigate through Tokyo. You also talk about how LeBron James, the great basketball player, is really an expert at predicting plays in basketball games. So, can you talk about how schemas can be used as blueprints to just help us navigate situations, help us make predictions, to just help us get by in places that we've just never been before?
Well, as you know, we have such a limited set of resources in our brain, right? For attention, perception, thought. And so our brains are very economical. And a big way in which we can reduce the load, whether it's in perception or language or in memory, is to basically reduce the amount of information that we're trying to process. And a schema is a very powerful way to do it, right? So whether you're talking, you mentioned the cafe example of going into Starbucks and getting a frappuccino, right? There's so many aspects of that behavior that are so predictable that if I go into a Starbucks here, I go into a Starbucks in, an airport in Dallas or something, there's going to be so much because I already have that experience in memory. And so having a schema allows you to take a whole lot of complicated information and reduce it down and basically reuse it over and over again. So if you're a chess player and you've just done thousands and thousands of games, you've seen so many configurations of pieces and so many moves that people can do that you can basically watch a chess match and be able to reduce a whole sequence of moves between two players into one pattern that you've stored, which is the power of these schemas. As we said, it's like a blueprint, right? And so the blueprint says how everything relates to each other. And so if I know if I move a piece from one place to another, that has a particular meaning to a chess player, and they can see how every thing that can happen on the board relates to that one movement, right? And so a player like, well, the beauty of schemas is that on the one hand, they allow us to reduce the burden of what we have to remember. But on the other hand, schemas also allow us to see what's happening in real time and say, oh, I've seen this before. And so when you're watching a bunch of players go down the court, if you are a true expert of the game, somebody who's as intelligent as LeBron is, you're seeing what's happening, but you're matching it up to a schema, which is these patterns that you've experienced over and over again. And you're predicting exactly where the play is going to go before it happens. And people who talk about LeBron's playing talk about his basketball IQ, his ability to see plays before they even happen, right? And we all do this in everyday life to some extent. Like I can give my money to the cashier at Starbucks and I can predict that I will get a cup of coffee out of it. And if it doesn't come, I'll be mad because I've generated this prediction for the future and I expect it to come, right? So this is what allows us to both efficiently encode memories, but also to understand the present and to predict the future. So it's a very powerful resource we have.
Hmm. Actually, the topic of schema is how I met my husband, because schema, the idea of a schema was originally talked about by Roger Schenck. And my husband was a computer scientist, and he wanted to go to Legal Seafood in Boston, which is where the restaurant schema, so or script, was first thought of. And so we ended up going there. That's how we met.
Huh.
All right, but let's move on and let's talk about a topic that I think almost everyone has had the experience of, and that is having a sense of déjà vu. The idea that we've been here before, we've experienced this before, and it's just a really eerie feeling. And in your own experiments, you found that familiarity, like when we experience déjà vu, is different than episodic memory. So can you explain this?
Yeah. So we know that the hippocampus is important for episodic memory, but there's a lot of learning that takes place outside of the hippocampus, all over the brain. And what you can see if you scan people's brains is when people become more familiar with something, there's actually a tuning up, as we talked about with these cell assemblies. It's like every time there's an election that takes place, there's a party shakeup, and the party becomes more efficient and more resources get poured in. And you can see these brain changes happen really quickly, actually. So if I were to just ask you about, mention the word banana or something like that, this is a word that many people are highly familiar with because over and over and over again, you've just processed this word so much. But even if I told it to you one more time, we would see a little change in brain activity where the brain processing is a little bit faster and more efficient the second time around. But a word like rutabaga or a word like rambutan, these are words that might be more unfamiliar to people. And just the work in hearing that word is an indicator that it's not so familiar to you, right? And so we've all had these experiences of seeing someone's face and we know we've seen them before because our brains are processing them so fluently and efficiently, but we just don't have any ability to place it. And so there's an area of the brain called the perirhinal cortex where a lot of this information comes together that gives us the sense of things we've seen before and not seen before. And so when that sense is very strong, but we can't access an episodic memory to go with it, that's what gives us the sense of déjà vu. It's often a mismatch between this overwhelming sense of familiarity and the actual circumstances which are driving it. And in fact, people have shown artificially that if you stimulate the perirhinal cortex, you can make something seem familiar. And people who have seizures that activate the perirhinal cortex can just have this overwhelming sense of déjà vu. So it seems to be something in our brain that's related to learning about people, places, and things.
So you write about curiosity, and the psychologist George Loewenstein described that curiosity is actually a gap between what we already know and what we want to know. And I think a lot about curiosity because I study when people go on the internet, when people use their smartphones, sometimes they go into rabbit holes, they can't pull themselves out. And in fact, one statistic I saw, and I'm not even sure I can believe this, is that people spend an average of 13 hours a day on some kind of device. So do you think this drive to seek information on our devices, whether it's our smartphones or computers, tablets, can this explain why people overuse their devices? Are people just simply driven by curiosity?
Well, boy, that's such a tough question. I feel like you're much better placed to answer it than me, but I'll do my best. So I think what's interesting about these devices is they often actually lead you down. I mean, occasionally you do get these moments, like I call them Wikipedia wormholes, where you get curious about something and then you look into it online and then you find something in the Wikipedia article and you click on that. And then next thing you know, 10 minutes have gone by and you've just been so curious about that information. And that feeling of curiosity, at least in our work, our work suggests that it's linked to activity in the dopamine system. And dopamine is what energizes us to get rewards. But curiosity is basically the act of being energized to get information, to resolve uncertainty. And so, just like if you're hungry, it's not really a pleasant feeling, but it motivates you and energizes you to get food. When we're curious, it's kind of a hunger for information and it motivates us to find the answers. Now, I think devices can sometimes lead you and make you more curious, although sometimes they can send us in the opposite direction. I think clickbait is a good example of the art of harnessing curiosity and maybe even weaponizing it. Where if you say, well, here's 4 tips from a neuroscientist on how to improve your memory, they'll go, wait, 4 tips. I can only think of 2. I better check that out. Or even worse, they'll say, here's 4 things that you're doing that are making your memory bad. And so the people will have to click to find out. Um, but you see a lot of the same dynamics in action, I think, when devices are trying to give you likes, for instance, for doing things. And or you just get view counts and you're like, oh, this has been seen by 10 people or whatever. And I think those give you a kind of a reward response that's actually not so much about curiosity, but more about building up habits, because it's almost addictive sometimes. I think when you get these likes, you're stimulating the dopamine system in a different way.
So, you mentioned that people find it easier to remember positive experiences than negative experiences. It might be easier, but I know that a lot of times I remember negative experiences quite easily. But you also mentioned that we tend to remember things from our formative years of the ages 10 to 30. Why is it that we remember more things during these formative years?
Well, yeah. And so I want to be clear, negative events are quite easy to remember too. And the difference is not so much that we can't remember negative events as well as positive events, but we have a bias to remember positive events on average more. Now, people with clinical depression don't have this bias and they actually have a negative bias, but healthy individuals who are non-depressed have a positive memory bias on average, and they tend to remember the events and themselves in a slightly more positive way than they really happen. And so, and often that act of remembering is a way in which people regulate their emotions. It's a source of happiness when people reminisce and engage in nostalgia. And when you look at people's autobiographical memories, the memories that they go back to over and over again, they occur during these formative years between, let's say, the ages of 14 to 30. And that's the period of time, we call it the reminiscence bump, because you plot the memories that people have over time. They tend to recall these events. There's a little bump in that curve between the ages of 14 to 30. And it's probably because that's when people start to get a sense of who they are. And so these experiences that are central to who you are happening during that period. And so people recall them more. And the more you recall these events, the more memorable they are and the more embedded they become into your life narrative. So it kind of snowballs as we go over time.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's talk about false memories. So, as we're watching the trial of Donald Trump, right, we're seeing conflicting stories, what Stormy Daniels says, what Donald Trump says, each claiming different things. Of course, it's very likely that one of these individuals could be lying. But it's also possible that they each has a different memory of what happened. And I recently watched the documentary of Joan Baez, which is just a really fantastic documentary. And she relays about how she might have a false memory of having been abused as a young girl. So a lot of people have false memories or they claim to have false memories. what actually happens? What's behind a false memory? Why do people have them?
Well, I think this goes back to our conversation about how memory is like a painting, right? That is, that we recall little bits and pieces when we remember, but then those bits and pieces are synthesized with imagination. So sometimes what can happen is that we remember things, but we put it together in a story that's just wrong. And so there are certain people, like I talk about Brian Williams, the journalist, who had created a false memory of having gone down or having been in a helicopter that was hit by enemy fire while being over Iraq. And it turned out that, in fact, he was in a helicopter over Iraq. So he remembered that part right. But the central part of his story was that his helicopter got shot, and that was incorrect. But if you look over time, what happened was he was initially remembering it properly, but then he would tell the story over and over, and it increased, the errors increased over time. Because what can happen is that each time we tell the story, we're telling it with a particular message, and we're using some imagination to fill in the blanks. But now that becomes incorporated into the memory. And so a story that we tell over and over again can have traces of every time that we remembered in it. So it's like a copy of a copy of a copy almost. And so that's a memory that is embellished to the point where it strays from reality. But there's other cases where people can have memories for things that never happened in the first place. And your colleague Elizabeth Loftus did groundbreaking work in this area. And the recipe for this is basically people trying to remember something that didn't happen. Like, let's say if you're in a false memory a repressed memory therapy procedure, and you're told by somebody you did get abused, you just don't remember it. Well, what happens is that then you search memory and you say, hey, wait a minute, what could have happened? And you pull up memories from your life, and then you think about how they could have gone differently than how you remembered it, but it doesn't really ring true to you. But then the next time you come in, well, now I'm remembering that same time period, but I've got some confusion between the actual bits that I remembered and the things that I imagined. And now I synthesize the things that I imagined and the things that I remembered into a story. And I use imagination to layer upon that even further. And so what can happen is you can have these bits and pieces of all of these different experiences that become stitched together into this tapestry that's this gorgeous, detailed false memory that seems very real because you are remembering, but you're remembering something that never happened. You're remembering something that never happened in reality. It was only something that happened in your head as you imagined it and reimagined it over and over again.
Hmm. Well, let's move on to misinformation, which is something that is, really important topic. And you talk about how people are less likely to be susceptible to misinformation when they actively engage with other people, compared to just passively consuming information like we all do with social media. Not all of us, but quite a few. Um, so is there, but then again, I'm also thinking, what if people in our friend circle face to face pass on misinformation? Because that can happen too. But is there a lesson here on how we might reduce the spread of misinformation? Should we spend less time on social media and more time face to face with other people?
Well, absolutely. I think that it definitely helps to spend time face to face and not as much on social media. But I think part of the issue that we have with misinformation, and there's many issues, but one issue is that it's often very hard to remember the context in which we got information. That is, we might remember that we heard something about, let's say, Donald Trump, or we heard something about Joe Biden, or we heard something about, some celebrity that we've been following. And we don't know where we heard it. Did we hear it on a news report on NPR, or did we hear it from somebody on Facebook? And so what often happens is that people hear things, and then they hear things from multiple sources because we're all talking to each other. And so I tell somebody in my social network, and they tell somebody in the same social network, and so forth. And so at some point, you start hearing the same things over and over again, and you don't put in the mental work to figure out, well, where did I hear that from? But the more times you hear it, it takes on a life of its own. It feels more true to you. And so social networks can create this illusion of truth because to some extent, truth to us is just stuff that we've heard over and over. And so it seems true. And I think that's a big problem that we have. And part of the problem too, though, is that we don't have the time to evaluate, we don't put in the time to evaluate the accuracy of things that we get. And we often, we're especially vulnerable to misinformation if it comes in a flavor that we like, right? So if it confirms our beliefs, well, then it's a lot easier to believe it. And so we're not going to put in the work to say, well, where did I get this information from? And can I trust it? Is it just something that I've heard from 10 people who are all reading the same blog or something like that? And I think the way we inoculate yourself is number one, get more sources, get diverse sources of information. And number two, make sure to put in the time to really think critically about things, especially if they're things that we want to believe. If it seems, so consistent with your beliefs, those are probably the pieces of information that we should be the most skeptical about.
Okay, good advice. Let's talk about how to improve our memory. So you give some really good tips on how we can remember things, how we can make them stand out amidst the flotsam and jetsam of all this stuff in our minds. And you talk about using attention and intention. Can you explain this?
Yeah. So attention is basically whatever we're focusing on at a given time, right? So I'm right now in this room and there's a zillion things that I could be paying attention to. Now, I am using intention, for instance, to focus on you and to tune out the noise of this leaf blower outside, because my goal right now is to communicate with you and to communicate with all the people in the online audience. And so that's intention, my ability to focus attention on what's relevant to my goals at this moment. But let's say if I was tired and I'm sleepy and maybe I'm multitasking or something like that, my attention might be grabbed by the leaf blower outside and I might have trouble focusing it on what's relevant at the time. So what does this have to do with memory? Well, the fact is that if we are not able to fully focus our attention on what is relevant to us in a given moment, we're not going to be able to remember it as well, because our memory is dependent, our ability to remember an event is dependent on how much it stands out relative to all of the other experiences that we could be remembering. And so it really depends on me to think meaningfully about what you are telling me at a given time. It's relevant to my ability to focus on the sights and sounds of this particular unique experience. And so intention is what allows us to do that. And in fact, if I give you strategies, I can give you a strategy for memorizing names. I can give you a strategy for remembering to do things in the future, like taking out the trash and so forth. But without intention, you will not use those strategies. And I can't help you in that case. So a big part of successful remembering, being able to initiate strategies, or even just being able to be in the moment and capture what you want to remember at a given point, relies on intention. And that in turn depends on these prefrontal cortex resources that we've talked about. But there's so many factors in modern life that are taking away those resources from us that to some extent we're not able to remember with intention. And so we remember things that are inane at the expense of things that are important.
Oh, well put. So I think everyone here is probably very interested to learn about how sleep affects our memories. So what happens to our memories when we sleep, and what happens when we don't get good quality sleep?
Well, we know for that sleep seems to have many functions, and for every function we learn about, there seem to be 10 more that we don't even know about yet. One thing that happens during sleep is the brain does a lot of its housekeeping. So it clears out, for instance, a lot of toxins like amyloid proteins, for instance, that accumulate during the day. And amyloid is one of the proteins that's implicated in Alzheimer's disease. Now, a lot of this is controversial right now. I can get more into it later on, but one thing we know about sleep too is that information in memory seems to be reactivated during sleep. A lot of the neurons that were active during a particular experience during the waking day can come online and reactivate again in the same sequence during sleep. And that seems to play a role in allowing us to integrate information that we've just experienced with information that we already knew, and taking in information that was just from our random episodic memories and using it to supplement and enrich our semantic memory or knowledge about the world. So it allows us to transform these memories that we have. So when we're not getting good quality sleep, we may be missing out on a lot of those processes that allow us to consolidate these days' experiences and build this rich knowledge out of it. But another part of it is that when we're sleep deprived, it seems to affect the prefrontal cortex in particular and the hippocampus, but especially the prefrontal cortex. So people's attentional resources are not going to be as strong. It's not going to be driven by goals, but rather it'll be driven by whatever grabs you at a given moment. So we have trouble focusing on what's relevant, and we're more vulnerable to distractions, and and we're just tired, really. So as a result, you're just blasting every part of what's important for forming new memories. So really, when we're not getting enough sleep, we're missing out on a lot, and it's not really improving our productivity to get less sleep and do more during the waking day.
Actually, we found that as people accumulate sleep debt, which is consecutive days where you're not getting enough sleep, people spend more and more time on social media. And we found this with college students who are notoriously bad at getting good sleep.
Now,
So
does the social media use reduce people's sleep further because like they get more
yes,
stress?
it's cyclical, right?
Okay.
It's cyclical. So I think we have time for one more question. And I really found this point to be very, very intriguing. And you brought it up at the end of your book. And you said that episodic memory, which you explained what it is, tends to decline as we age, but semantic memory remains strong. And this is the part that I found most intriguing. You're proposing, this is your hypothesis, that perhaps the reason for this is so that elders of a society can relay their cultural knowledge on to younger people of a community. So can you say more about that?
Yeah, and I mean this was a speculation that I had, to be honest, but it's something that really helped me make sense of something that I've struggled with for a long time. So the world of memory research, the standard view is, well, your memory tends to be episodic memory, I should say, tends to be bad during childhood. And part of that is because the prefrontal cortex is underdeveloped. Then you have this period of time in young adulthood where the prefrontal cortex is at its maximal functional level and we're forming great episodic memories. And from the age of 30 on, it starts to decline. And that's concurrent with episodic memory declines. Now, as we said, knowledge about the world seems to stay the same, but for whatever reason, our ability to form these tight, goal-focused memories only seems to occur during these prime young adulthood years, which actually coincide with our reproductive years and our years of child rearing, right? But there's not a lot of species that live past that point, that really will live much past the point of reproduction and, parenting. And humans have this capability to live long past their reproductive years. And one of the things that occurred to me over the course of researching this book is maybe there's a reason for the fact that people have this capability to live past their reproductive years. And maybe that goes along with the way the brain is developing. So there's a lot of work suggesting that in other species like orcas that live past their reproductive years, there's an evolutionary advantage to having them be around to educate younger orcas and to pass on their knowledge to other orcas in the pod. And in fact, orca pods are led by females that are past menopause. So they're led by essentially the elders of their pod. And likewise, if you look in many human societies, they're led by elders. And their role is not so much to form new memories, but rather to pass on the memories that they've already built up, which is a lot in semantic memory, really. And so it just seems this compelling parallel that as you get older, at least in terms of evolution, it probably was the case that people tended to fall into roles that are less about, essentially themselves and less about advancing their own lives and more about the group around them and more about sharing their knowledge with others. And so I think that it's possible that the way the brain changes with age may be just in line with the way humans change over the courses of their lives, at least in many societies, not necessarily the one we live in now, but.
Okay, fascinating.
Gloria, thank you so much for such a prepared and thoughtful walk through Charan's book. It's really appreciate that how careful you were with getting it all and delivering it all. Thank you so much. There were so many things that I want to follow up with in after hours, but I want to remind folks a couple things. Number one, both Charan and Gloria will be at after hours today. It's going to start at 8:05 in about 7 minutes from now. We're going to give them a 5-minute break in between these two. After hours, you can come to after hours by buying a copy of Why We Remember. And then Fan is going to do a BOGO. We're going to give away a free copy at after hours. So buy a copy, come to after hours, come hang out with us. We'll put in a link there for you to claim a second copy. Give it to a friend, a parent, a colleague, anybody that you might think of. So great opportunity to ask a lot of questions that people might have about memory. I know a lot of questions came in earlier, just even among people, and I've been talking about this, about wanting to know about dementia and Alzheimer's, and like, gosh, I can't seem to ever know where my keys are. And here I am in Whole Foods. I don't remember that woman's name. And people, especially when they get to be about 50 or so, they really start worrying. Does this mean I have some sign of it, et cetera, et cetera? And I know that your book talks about some of this and talks about not everything is worth remembering, like that woman's name that you were on the bake sale with. It's okay to forget her name, and I want to talk about the role of scent. I collect perfume and the role of scent and the focus of scent. Anyway, enough about me. 7:59. Quick question. I think you can answer it quickly, that Kathy had posted during the event. She says, what's the difference between a false and a true memory of both are pieced together in bits and pieces? A little bit redundant, but you get the idea.
Yeah, we tend, so actually my advisor, one of my advisors, Marcia Johnson, did this work to really show how hard it is to tell the difference between things that we remembered versus things that we imagined. Because once you imagine something, you can have a memory for what you imagined. Yeah. And so really, once we remember something, that experience is just something that's going on in our head. And you have to figure out where that information came from. And so the information that we've actually experienced in the real world, it tends to be associated with more sensory detail, the sights, the sounds, the smells, and it also tends to be accompanied with a stronger emotion and a little bit more of a sense of context. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that when you remember something, you can ask yourself, okay, do I have this kind of availability of all these details that are irrelevant to the story, but they put me back in this place and time? That's a good cue that you really did experience it, and it's not something that you imagine. All right. Well, thank you for that. We're at 8:01. We're a minute over. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Hope to see you Thursday night with Susan Golden Meadow and Carol Dweck. That's going to be